Well, Senator Kaine, welcome to Mount Vernon.
Doug, it's great to be back with you. I wish I was in person, as I have been many times, but I'm glad to be doing this discussion with you virtually today and look forward to being at Mount Vernon soon.
Well, so the idea of the conference is called Leadership for a More Perfect Union. And General John Allen and I were talking about America in crisis. We're facing some tremendous problems with the pandemic, with social issues, with economic disruption, and lack of political trust. And we talked about, the importance of leadership in these times. So, and service. If you don't mind, if you could tell us first, Senator, why did you decide a career in public service was for you?
Doug, it was, a little bit accidental. I've had kind of an accidental political career. I was a missionary in Honduras for a year in the middle of law school, and that made me decide I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer to help the least of these, basically. So I moved to Richmond, married a wonderful Virginian, my wife, Ann. I worked as a civil rights lawyer for 17 years, but I got mad at my city council one day because it was too racially divided on issues of controversy. White members would vote one way, African-American members would vote the other way. And I thought, I was a naive young person. I thought I could be a good bridge builder. And that got me into politics. And it was at the local level and, building schools, filling potholes, fighting crime. I loved it. I then was on my way out of politics after my second term as mayor. And a friend who was running for lieutenant governor announced she couldn't because she had pancreatic cancer. So I thought about it. Life is often just these weird things that happen, sometimes good, sometimes bad, that push you in directions you didn't know you would go. I opened up chapter 2. I then served as lieutenant governor and governor. And then I was on my way out of politics again. And President Obama asked if I would be chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He and I were close. That then led into me running for the Senate. So I never intended to go into politics. I was on my way out of politics twice, but my Honduras experience made me put me on a spiritual journey of just trying to help other people in a simple way. And it's developed into this now 27-year career of being in elected office. And I'm so glad that I went down a path that I didn't initially see for myself.
Well, I'm delighted you did as well. And thank you for your service. You have stumbled into, in your political career, some of the storied seats of American political leadership. I mean, you are in the Senate. I think you're in Monroe's seat, Senator Monroe's seat, Virginia. And of course, as governor of Virginia, you're in the seat of Jefferson and Patrick Henry and many other great governors from our early history. What, how does history for you as a Virginian, in this role, how does it play into the way you think about your job?
Doug, I'm a huge reader of history and really try to extract the lessons of it. I love a Harry Truman quote, "The only thing new under the sun is the history you don't know." So much of life gets illuminated by historical trends. So I guess I would say the way that the history most informs my mission is a belief that our America began with a promise we made about ourselves that wasn't true when we made it, but that still was a good promise, that all are created equal. Jefferson articulated that in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson is viewed as the founder of the Democratic Party, the oldest political party in the world. He put that in the Declaration as one of a number of self-evident truths, plural. But at Gettysburg, Lincoln, who founded the Republican Party, boiled it down to one proposition, a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So I sort of view the American story as we set a goal out before ourselves. It was a perfect goal. We're imperfect people. It's sort of like a North Star that a sailor can orient by without ever reaching it, but it's good to orient by it. And when we do, we progressively get closer to who we said we would be. And of course, we're imperfect. So then we drift away from it. And then problems are caused and there's challenges. I loved in the inauguration the other day, the young Amanda Gorman, the poet laureate, said, "We're not a broken nation, simply an unfinished one." We're on a journey. And the journey has many, many miles to go. But when we orient right, we become more like who we said we would be. And that's sort of my view of our history and how it informs the work that I've tried to do as a civil rights lawyer and as an elected official.
Well, you express it in an inspiring way and I think speaks to a lot of what Americans believe across both parties and independents. But you brought up this word naive earlier. As you launched your career, thinking you could help things work better in Richmond, and then you did, right? I mean, it was naive, but it got you in there and it got you going. So, how can naivete still help you now that you're a grizzled old veteran of the battles as we try to confront these huge crises the country's facing?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I think without naivete, most of the good work in the world wouldn't get done.
Yeah.
My mother always told me, Tim, you have to make a decision in life. If you want to be right, be a pessimist, but if you want to do right, be an optimist. So there's also a willed element of, are you going to be an optimist or pessimist? I think I continually run up against recognition of my own naivete. I remember one of my first awakenings in the Senate was when we passed comprehensive immigration reform in 2013, nearly 70 votes, very bipartisan. I worked real hard on it. And we got it done in the Senate, and it was going over to a Republican House. I knew they wouldn't just adopt our bill, but I thought for sure they would do their own version, and then we'd get in conference and hammer it out together. Instead, they never took the bill up, either ours or their own, in committee for years. And I was like sort of shocked. So I continued to run up against my own over optimism, my own naivete. But I do think, it's very important to approach the world. There's biblical invocations to suffer the little children unto me and behave like a child. There's a wonderful Karl Marx quote, of all people: a man cannot become a child again lest he become childish, but should he not take pleasure in a child's naivete and seek to emulate its truth at a higher level? We have to shed our cynicism and the scar tissue that life gives us and approach things fresh. And when we do, we're more creative and we're more likely to get results.
Yeah, I love it, and it sounds great. But the reality is, we're facing right now. We're going to see another 100,000 deaths in the next 20 days from this pandemic. It's going to get worse in the short term, and then we have to see great leadership beyond the pandemic. How do we start to repair, the nation, a lot of the challenges that have been revealed really during this year. So, what are some of your goals as a leader in the Senate to try to help? Solve problems this year?
Well, Doug, you're kind to call me a leader in the Senate, and I want to tell you, I'm not in leadership, not in Democratic leadership, and I'm not a committee chair. I chair two subcommittees, one in armed services, one in foreign relations. But I've decided that my leadership role in the Senate is to be a bridge builder with Republican colleagues, and so that's going to be my charism, is what the Catholics might call it, my unique gift I can bring, having been a civil rights lawyer and built bridges over racial divides in my own city. I hope I can do the same, and I've tried to do that in the Senate. So I think the immediate priorities that we have before us are, first, we're talking just days after the inauguration, you and I, we've got to get the Biden leadership team in place. Many of our federal agencies, cabinet departments, have been sort of hollowed out at the top. We got to put a team in place because there's so many big issues on the table. We need competent managers addressing them. But then second, I think we still have to demonstrate to the American public, well, you talked about the death toll from COVID, that we recognize their suffering. There's a health suffering, there's a mental health suffering, there's an economic suffering. We have to recognize that suffering and then come together to address it. And there are many aspects of that, whether it's economic support, unemployment insurance, whether it's, really accelerating a deployment of the vaccine that reaches into every corner, not just metropolitan America, or not just blue states, or not just people with the money to afford the vaccine. We've got to show we can do that. And I think if we can come together, trust and bipartisanship is a set of steps, not just one giant leap. If we can come together early in this new administration and deliver some relief that shows Americans Congress is listening, Congress is trying to act. Obviously, we've done a lot already in 2020, but we want to do more, we can start to earn some trust. And, bipartisanship is a little bit like a muscle. If you exercise it, it gets stronger. If you don't, it gets weaker. So if we can make some headway early in dealing with COVID, it may build momentum for more, bipartisanship on things like immigration reform for the first time since 1986, or meaningfully addressing gun safety consistent with the Second Amendment. There's a lot of challenges before us.
Well, I love, though, that spirit of can-doism that comes through when you talk about this. And I reflect in history of Lyndon Johnson's presidency as someone who was a creature of the Senate, like President Biden is a creature of the Senate. I mean, in the best possible way. He knew how to get things done in a very divided time in America's history, at a time when people thought the Senate was a completely broken and failed institution in the late 50s and 60s. And the extraordinary legislation that he was able to get through, even, at a time of a very divided Senate. So, hope can spring eternal here. Do you think Biden's history as a senator will guide him a little bit?
I really do, Doug, and I'm glad you put your finger on that. Not since LBJ have we had a president who had as much experience in the Senate and loved the Senate as much as Joe Biden does. I mean, he loves the Senate, Judiciary Committee, Foreign Relations Committee. Many of the senators are people who've worked closely with Joe Biden. I'd never served in the Senate with him, but I know him very well because my first 4 years in the Senate, he was vice president. We worked on a lot of items together. What I notice in my colleagues is there's no edge as they talk about Joe Biden. So the Republican senators, if I heard them talk about Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, there's often an edge in their words, but that's not the case with Joe. They may not agree with him on this or that, or if he says a gaffe, they may joke about it, but there's an affection, and they recognize him as a good man. And so that mutual regard does not immediately transform policy disagreements into, agreements, but it does open up opportunities to listen and dialogue and find the middle ground. And if we can't do all that I want, how about this portion that we should agree with? And I can see in his opening plan about dealing with COVID, Republicans want to accelerate vaccine deployment in their states. Republicans realize that we've got to have better broadband in rural America, because what we've learned during the pandemic is, hey, telehealth is great. Teleeducation is fine. It's great to visit with family members by Zoom, but you can only do it if you've got good broadband, and so much of rural America, red America, is left out of it. So I do see areas of significant potential cooperation, and I think Biden will prioritize that in a good way.
Well, Biden's inaugural was lovely, intoning on unity. For my taste, not enough quotes from George Washington, who, of course, was the original unifier and who stood above party. As much as us Virginians love our Thomas Jefferson, it was Washington that they all looked up to. So, Washington's farewell address, I want to talk about it in two contexts. Good. First, in this context of, a partisan spirit and the danger of partisan spirit, and then also about America's place in the world. And I know that you're obviously heavily involved in that. So let's start. We'll stay on this partisan line. Washington struggled in his own time with party spirit sort of getting out of control, and he talked about the danger of, one party coming in and taking vengeance on another party who comes in then and take vengeance. And from my point of view, we've seen a lot of this, really going back to the 90s since the wall fell, where you had, Congress going from one party to the other and then getting voted out after 2 years. And how can we break that cycle and recognize that compromise is a value as well as a tactic?
Well, I will say you're right. We didn't hear words of Washington in the inaugural, but the Washington farewell address is the only speech that's read every year in Congress on or around Washington's birthday. And every year, and it goes back, that tradition goes back a very long time. And the reader alternates between a Democrat and Republican, and it's a very powerful speech. I think Washington, Washington was probably healthily naive about some things, because as he was decrying partisanship, you also had the architects of the Constitution basically understanding human motivations and writing in the Federalist Papers, well, the way to deal with human ambition is to check it off against itself. The checks and balances notion, the Hamilton and Madison and John Jay, I think they understood the human tendencies, ambition, or legitimate differences of opinion, and then how that needed to be set off against each other to try to diffuse power and not let power grow into an authoritarian, monolith on one side or the other. But Washington was above that, and maybe a little pleasantly naive. I think there are things we can do that are formal in the Senate to try to bring about more harmony. And in fact, as you know, the design of the Senate does this. We've just recently come through this very challenging attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Remember this, in the House, more than half of the Republicans in the House voted to overturn Electoral College results from Pennsylvania and Arizona. In the Senate, 8 out of 51 Republicans, so 15% of Republicans. So what explains the difference between only 15% of Senate Republicans trying to overturn objections where more than half of House Republicans? When you respond to a statewide electorate, it has a more naturally moderating effect than if you represent a gerrymandered House district. So the Senate is set up in a way where we should be able to take the bigger perspective, step back from the partisanship. I'm hoping that's the case. We haven't gotten a good grade on that recently, at least on big items we haven't. But again, I'm not a pessimist about going forward. So there's some formal things we can do in rules. But John Warner told me when I ran for the Senate, he said, look, anything wrong in the Senate, it's not sick building syndrome. It's not in the water supply. It's in the attitudes of the people who walk into the building every day. And so you should walk into the building every day with a commitment to do, your best to make it work better.
Oh, I'm a big fan of John's, and he's doing well as well, though, he's getting up there, but a great leader himself.
Indeed. I really model, I want to be humble about the way I say this. I view him as a role model. I wouldn't claim his mantle because I don't think anybody can, but I view him as a role model.
Well, I'm sure he knows that, and he loves it as well. So Washington's farewell address also talks about America's place in the world in ways that, in some ways, are really out of date, because at the time the country was a tiny, barely new, struggling country with no military power to speak of, no real place in the world of European diplomacy, which dominated his perspective. And he wanted America to stay out of entangling alliances, which is a Jeffersonian phrase. But at any rate, America now has a very different place in the world as a superpower. You are on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and so how do you think America's role in the world needs to function? And where are we trying to go? With you, if you were all of a sudden in charge of America in the world, where would you try to steer us?
Well, first about Washington, you're right. That aspect of the speech to avoid permanent alliances or permanent enemies was a very powerful one, and it's one of two, good faith American foreign policy traditions. I would say it's the Washington tradition is one, and the Teddy Roosevelt tradition. When Teddy Roosevelt was Secretary of the Navy, we grew the Navy into the biggest in the world and probably became the most powerful military in the world. And then Roosevelt also got the Nobel Prize for helping broker the peace deal that ended the Russo-Japanese War. So that was the emergence of the U.S. as global military power, global peacemaking power, largest economy in the world, all happened 1890 to the end of the Teddy Roosevelt term. So we kind of alternate between these poles. What's the right strategy for a Joe Biden, a Biden administration, or in my own view on the Foreign Relations Committee? The world does work better for America and for others when the U.S. is deeply engaged in global efforts, World Health Organization, Paris Climate Accord, which President Biden has rejoined. The big problems of our planet are not problems that know borders. So coronavirus, refugee issues, climate change, there are big problems that can't be solved with robust assertions of sovereignty of 170 nations. There has to be a cooperative spirit. Look at how we use space these days for telecommunications, not just defense, but exploration, radio satellites. Well, not everyone can put everything up in space without it running into each other, unless there's some cooperation to figure out how to do that. So
I couldn't find a parking lot in DC without a satellite. So,
exactly, right?
Yeah.
so there has to be significant global cooperation, and it frankly works better for the U.S. and for the world when the U.S. is deeply engaged in it. I think where we sometimes blunder, and it would be a blunder that Washington would immediately recognize and warn us against, is sort of too much patting ourselves on the back, the notion of American exceptionalism, the notion of America as the indispensable nation. That can kind of grate against other countries who feel good about themselves. They love the U.S., they want us involved, but it doesn't necessarily make them feel warm and fuzzy when we go around telling everybody that we're better than everyone else. I've always said, instead of being indispensable, let's try to be exemplary, living up to the promises we make about ourselves, like the equality promise. And you know what? If we try to be exemplary, we're more likely to be indispensable than if we try to be indispensable. And that is a way of projecting power by example. As Joe Biden says, the issue should not be the example of American power, but the power of the American example. If we just live up to our own values, the equality principle, opportunity, innovation and creativity, the freedoms of religion and speech and belief and peaceful assembly. So many people around the world don't live in those societies. I lived in a military dictatorship in Honduras where people would have yearned for the freedoms that we had in the United States. So if we just double down on what we've promised about ourselves, that's probably the best way to have outsized influence in a very complicated world.
I love that idea and that thought. And I think it's also the secret to American unity, because it's the values that we share that make us the people we are. Here at Mount Vernon, of course, we teach people. We teach them about the founding. We teach them the history of the nation, particularly through the perspective and the story of George Washington. And you just mentioned the military dictatorship in Honduras. They had a written constitution that looked a lot like the U.S. Constitution, but what they didn't have was a tradition of civilian control of the military that goes back to the stories of Washington and many, many others since then.
Yes.
We have to teach these stories, right? I mean, people have to know them. And so I think, we've seen just since the last election how easy it is for these norms, once they're dismissed, like acknowledging that you've lost an election, can scratch the thin veneer of our civic religion here. And so what role do you see, education, civics, and history to teach these values that we share, that come from our founding and have persisted and been fought over throughout our history? What role does the federal government have in that at all?
Doug, you ask a really important question, and Mount Vernon is on the leading edge of this. But I think what we saw in the violent attack on the Capitol was a real failure of education and civics. And, I read a very prescient quote of Ulysses Grant's from 1875, 10 years after the Civil War ended, at the end of his second term as president. He was speaking to a group of Civil War veterans in Des Moines. And I don't have the quote in front of me, but he basically said, look, if there's going to be another war like the one we just went through, the dividing line won't be Mason and Dixon's dividing line. It will be a division between patriotism, intelligence, and ambition, superstition, and ignorance. And you know what? The purpose of that speech was to promote education as the antidote to superstition and ignorance. Right. But sadly, an awful lot of the people who engaged in the big lie that the election was stolen or that it was rigged or there was fraud were not uneducated people. They were very educated people. Some were ambitious people who were perpetrating a big lie for their own ends. But sadly, some trained military members, trained members of law enforcement, and others were educated, but they were gullible, and they fell easy prey. They were marks to ambitious leaders preaching the big lie. And so how do we equip people in our education system to understand the value of our traditions, peaceful transfer of power, but also to be critical thinkers so they can separate out the dross from the gold and understand what's true and what they should be wary of. I think there were some in that attack when we were in the chambers who were violent. There were some who were racist and neo-Nazi and neo-Confederate, but there were many who weren't violent and they weren't racist, but they were deeply gullible. And that should challenge us as educators, whether it's at Mount Vernon or I'm on the education committee too. Health, education, labor, pension needs to challenge us to figure out how to transmit the important reasons for our institutions in a more not skin deep, but surface penetrating way.
Yeah, I mean, both of your last two responses keep bringing to mind, on the one hand, America we need to lead by example and also be there when we're needed, but not do it in such a way that's arrogant. And this other thing about we have to recognize the complete failure that we've done. I mean, we need a lot of humility, it seems to me, as we approach both of these issues, that we're clearly not educating people as well as we think we should be. And, or very least, we're not helping them continue that education throughout their lives. It isn't just what you do K through 12, it's what you do afterward as well that matters, and what you hear and how these institutions are talked about and what our leaders in public service demand of each other.
I think the humility word is very important. As a member of Foreign Relations, we had the confirmation hearing for Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, and his predecessor had said the key was swagger. And Tony Blinken said the key was humility and confidence. Humility about ourselves, but confidence that small d democracy is in fact the right path. And even as grim as January 6th was, and American adversaries around the world surely were gloating in it, January 20, where there then was a transfer of power, our adversaries around the world who hold on to it as long as they can, president for life or extending their term or jailing the press or whatever, they probably saw that and were frightened by it. Because even in the aftermath of this grim January 6th, we could still deliver. And so we could be humble about ourselves, but confident in our values, confident in the virtues of small d democracy. And we're not broken, we're unfinished.
I love it. I mean, humility is a powerful leadership value. It isn't weak. It isn't passive. It's about being able to listen and then having good judgment. And that was how Washington deployed it. It was his most powerful leadership talent, I think, was his humility. But this is wonderful. And I do want to say it wasn't just January 20th that the rest of the world hopefully saw, but the work that you did on January 6th. The Senate and the House came back and did your duty and finished the job. I mean, that was as important as what happened on the 20th, I think.
And Doug, I'll say about that, it was really interesting. We were escorted into a hearing room in the Hart Building that had been outfitted for us to do our work in case.
Right.
And so it was ready, and we could have just gotten in there and just plowed through the rest of the day's debate. But it was really interesting. 100 of us were in there, and nobody even had to look at each other and talk about it. When somebody at the front, like the sergeant at arms, said, we can work in here and complete the work, everybody just said, no, we're not doing it in here. We're please clear out the chamber. We don't care how long it takes, but we're going back in the chamber and we're going to finish. Yeah. And it was as if every one of the 100 had exactly the same thought at exactly the same second and articulated it. We knew that what we needed to do was be back in full view of the American public to complete the task that was set before us. And I was very proud of my colleagues. That was a unifying moment. I was very proud of them in that moment.
Yeah, and I was proud to be an American in that moment as well. And to thank you for your service again. I think we'll wrap up, but final thoughts, if you have any, on this challenging year. I would say you've got support here from Mount Vernon. Anytime you want to bring folks out and get them inspired to think about, what we can do as a nation and what we failed to do, we're happy to help. But where do you, how do you get yourself up every day and try to take on these massive problems?
Well, I will acknowledge you, Doug. It's been a challenging year. I mean, when we finished 2019, the Senate chaplain, I go to a bipartisan prayer breakfast every Wednesday morning. And the Senate chaplain in December 2019 said, okay, this is the last prayer breakfast of the decade. And it got me thinking about the decade of 2000 to January 1, 2020. And I realized virtually nothing that I would have predicted in 2010 would have come out the same way. In fact, I wouldn't have ever guessed I'd have been in the Senate. I wouldn't have guessed I would have had a son in the Marine Corps. I wouldn't have guessed I'd been on a national ticket. I got a daughter who's an actress. I got a son who's a visual artist. I wouldn't have guessed that Donald Trump would be president. I wouldn't have guessed that Democrats would be sweeping state offices in Virginia. I would have gotten everything wrong. And so I remember thinking in January of 2020, gosh, I wonder if there'll be any surprises this year. Impeachment, pandemic, a contested election, a violent attack on the Capitol. Man, it's just so your question is, how do you get up and go every day? Well, I do think this notion of sort of a willed optimism, humility about ourselves, and humility, I heard somebody describe it as humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. And so humility about ourselves, but confidence in our values. One of my other favorite presidents, Harry Truman, just had a belief: if my motives are pure and I pick good people and I work very hard, then more often than not, it's going to work out better. Not all the time, but more often than not, it's going to work out better. And just that simple faith in our values and in the capacity of people well-motivated, working hard to achieve things that are greater than themselves. I believe it because the evidence tells me that that's right.
Well, and that belief is what got you in the work you're in. So, congratulations, keep going and keep your chin up, and it will all together pull together and get this done, I think. Okay. Well, thank you.
Thanks so much for Mount Vernon's important work in telling a story of a person that values in the abstract are hard to grasp, but when they're centered in the life of a person, they're much easier for people to absorb. So the work that you do to use the exemplary, complicated, interesting George Washington to center these values is so important. And I look forward to joining you at Mount Vernon soon.
Thank you very much.